Welcome to Richmond Park, one of the royal parks that's just outside of London. I spend a lot of time here because of friends and family, and it's a really interesting mix of the natural environment and the built environment. And you can see an example of the built environment going past me. Richmond Park lies on the flight path into Heathrow Airport, and central London itself is just through those trees behind me. When we talk about conservation, we can do conservation at different scales, and those scales can be really local. They can be at the species level, they can be bigger than species, and they can be at the habitat level, and they can also be really grand, really broad at the landscape level. So when you come to an environment like this one, even a managed environment, and you do conservation or you look at ecology, you are considering the natural environment and the built environment and the impacts that these things have on the diversity of animals and plants and how they thrive in that environment, as well as the impact of your conservation action at small scale, focused species level, and bigger scale at the landscape level, looking at the interactions of all of these plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, and other living organisms on the connectivity of biodiversity and how that biodiversity can best be conserved. Let's look at an example of conservation action. This is bracken. It's a native fern that is ubiquitous across the UK. But if left unmanaged, it can take over a habitat and it can then outcompete other species of plants that are important for wildlife to survive. So to manage bracken, it is rolled, crushed at a certain time of the year, usually in midsummer. I am filming this in August, and this allows other plants to grow through. This rolling or management of the bracken is performed once a species in Richmond Park that relies on the bracken, which are the red and fallow deer, and they rely on the bracken as a way of hiding their youngsters, is done after they have finished utilising this resource. The deer have their young, their fawns or calves, between May and July, and the bracken rolling takes place after this. So different species in the park benefit across the landscape by managing one example of a plant that would otherwise dominate the landscape and reduce the diversity of biodiversity that the park can support. So here is an example of where bracken hasn't been rolled. It's been left to grow to its full summer height. And this is excellent cover for deer, for where they're going to park their youngsters when they have their babies. But it smothers out all of the light, and that means it outcompetes other plants, and therefore it reduces the available biodiversity that the park can support. Because bracken is toxic, it's also very good at protecting itself from being eaten. So without management by the royal parks, bracken would become one of the dominant parts of vegetation in the park and therefore reduce available habitat for other species. You can see how tall it gets. It's completely overshadowing Debbie, my dog. She's not the biggest dog in the world, but it gives you an idea of just how tall this bracken can reach in the summer. Let's now have a look at an example of conservation at a really small scale, or much smaller than rolling huge pastures of bracken. This is the royal oak. It's one of the oldest of the veteran trees in Richmond Park and is estimated to be about 750 years old. There are approximately 1,300 veteran trees, i.e. trees that can be dated back to 300 to 500 years or earlier. The royal oak is an example of a species, so this is the English oak, Quercus robur, being managed in a particular way. And you can see that the tree is fenced off. That is to prevent soil impaction, which reduces available oxygen and moisture getting to the tree's roots. Mature oak trees like this one are some of the most biodiverse environments on Earth. They provide nesting areas for birds, habitat and shelter for mammals. They are also home to a myriad of different species of insect. And there's an old saying that the best time to have planted a tree is 200 years ago. And the second best time to plant a tree is today. And that is because the longer a tree has to grow and the more chances it has of becoming mature, the more resources it can provide for a wider range of species. And the reason that Richmond Park is so special is because this mixture of acid grassland and mature forest that provides multiple different niches, which are habitat areas that particular species are best adapted to within one area. So there is a complex network of biodiversity that ultimately sustains the functioning of the wider ecosystem of the park. So we have looked at an example of conservation on a landscape level, managing the bracken across the park, and conservation action on a species level, managing the area around one veteran oak tree to ensure it can continue to thrive. Richmond Park dates to around 1625, when it was first walled by Charles I to be used as a royal hunting ground. Although the origins of the park here are likely much older. The deer are still here, although they're not used for royal hunting pleasure anymore. But they too have to be managed because the park can only support a specific number of animals, and that's called a carrying capacity. So even though we have a natural system that is left to its own devices for most of the year, human intervention is required to ensure that one animal species doesn't go out of balance and affect the survival and viability of others. The age of the park and the fact that for a lot of its time it's been the preserve of royalty means there's very little disturbance that has occurred to the soil of the park, and it's received no improvement. That means nobody's used fertiliser, pesticides or herbicides. The park has always been full of wildlife in an area of the country that is often considered wildlife depleted. And Royal Parks still uses natural methods of managing the park that would have been around in the time of Charles I to ensure that nature is not disrupted. For example, teams of shire horses are used to mow the grass, which is then fed to the deer, to give them supplementary feeding in the winter time. Shire horses are soft on the ground. Their hooves don't compact or disturb the soil like mechanics such as a tractor would. They're fast enough to allow the human workers the opportunity to get the job done on time, but slow enough to allow animals to move out of the way, so wildlife is not unduly harmed. And the movement of the horses through grasses and wildflowers would naturally spread their seeds. So this ancient tradition of horses and humans working together is really beneficial to the preservation and conservation of the landscape and the biodiversity in the park. We've looked at conserving and managing a landscape, and we've looked at conserving and managing a species. What about a particular habitat? Well, these veteran trees, as beautiful as they are, will still succumb to bad weather and be blown over in storms, like has happened here. But this deadwood is excellent habitats for a wide range of species that depend on rotting wood for parts of their life cycle. Stag beetles, for example, have to lay their eggs so their youngsters can feed on rotten wood of fallen trees. In a park of 600 deer, and remember these deer are all walled in, so their food is all contained within the park's boundaries. If you're growing a new wood, it has to be protected from all of those hungry mouths. So to manage this broad-leaved woodland, there requires fenced-off areas for new saplings to generate. These new saplings would simply be browsed and the woodland would degenerate if there was no management of new tree growth. So the habitat itself, which is the broadleaf woodland, is under natural processes, i.e. this tree has been brought down by the weather, but to ensure the continuation of the woodland, human help is required to ensure the growth of new saplings into new trees to continue the woodland's presence into the future. Although I've been talking about the deer and the trees and everything that is visible, it's important to consider species that we don't necessarily always see with the naked eye and how important they are to conservation as well. So next to me here is an anthill which has been made by yellow meadow ants, and these anthills are really important to the continuing success of biodiversity in the park. Although it might not look like much, this anthill is probably about 150 years old, and this patch of grassland in front of me is littered with them. These yellow meadow ants not only regulate all of the processes that go on in the soil, they help with soil turnover, they're also really important as a food source for some of the other biodiversity in the park. And one of those species that these yellow meadow anthills is really important to is the green woodpecker. Yes, it's a woodpecker because it nests in tree hollows, but it actually forages on the ground. And in the winter time, anthills like this one make up around 80% of its diet. The ants in the anthill, I should say. So we can't see the ants, they remain visible to us, but their presence is really, really important. And during COVID, when the park was used by more people, one of the key messages that was put out by Royal Parks was to not stamp on or damage the anthills. And that shows how fundamentally important they are. And it's a really good example of conservation psychology. Yes, we can't see the ants, but we must still appreciate their value, and we must appreciate what they give back to the natural environment and how they ensure that natural environment continues to function. They're not just beneficial for green woodpeckers, but they're beneficial for how we can appreciate the park because they help ensure its survival. I hope you have enjoyed this short video that has explained a bit about the interconnection between humans and animals when it comes to conservation. And particularly when we think about why conservation matters, we need to be aware of why our inputs are important to species survival and to ensure species viability into the long term. Even in apparently natural places like this one, human management is required. So our understanding of how we care for nature and why nature matters is fundamental supporting evidence to the success of conservation action. Thank you very much.